The town whispered that Noah Thorne was a wild man, a ghost in the high peaks who had forgotten their ways. But a father never forgets his son. He rode down from the mountain for medicine only to find his wife and child in chains, with price tags hanging from their necks. The town had made a mistake. They hadn't captured a beast, they had unleashed one. The snow hadn't yet melted from the higher ridges, and already spring was flooding the valley in golden light and restless winds. The birds returned, first always did, calling out between the pines like messengers trying to stir the earth back to life. Then came the cracking off rock ledges, snow bleeding into the creeks, and the trails turning soft with mud and secrets. Noah Thorne watched it all from his perch halfway up Granite Pass, a rough cabin clinging to the mountain shoulder like an old scar that refused to heal. He'd built the place with his own hands, stone by stone, log by log, the way his father had taught him, simple, strong, and far enough from town that trouble would have to crawl to find him. It had been 2 years since Noah brought his wife, Miriam, and their boy, Caleb, up the trail fleeing the chaos of Red Creek and the hands that wouldn't stop taking. He hadn't meant to disappear, not entirely, but when the world below chewed at your bones and left your soul hollow sometimes, you had to vanish just to breathe again. They called him the Mountain Man now, whispered about him in town, said he'd gone wild, said he talked to trees, said he was dangerous. Noah didn't mind. Better they fear his silence than try to break it. But this morning something was different. Caleb had woken in the night coughing hard enough to bring blood to his lips, and Miriam's face, pale in the lantern light, had told Noah everything he needed to know. It wasn't just a chill. The boy needed a healer, not the kind that brewed herbs in the dark. Red Creek had a doctor, and Red Creek was a day's ride through thawing mud, skittish bears, and memories Noah had buried beneath axe strokes and smoke. He left before dawn, saddlebag light, heart heavier than any pack. Miriam hadn't said a word when he pulled on his coat, just pressed a folded scrap of cloth into his hand. It was Caleb, stitched with blue thread and still warm from where it had been tucked under his pillow. Noah nodded once, tucked it close to his chest, and rode. He didn't stop to eat, didn't pause when his horse stumbled on the muddy incline. By the time the town came into view, dusk was already curling along the treetops, shadows stretching long and thin like warning fingers across the road. Red Creek hadn't changed much, but it felt different now. The signs were brighter, the saloon louder, more strangers on the boardwalks dressed in Eastern coats and city shoes. A banner flapped above the square, half torn but still proud. Spring auction today, goods, tools, and servants. Noah squinted at it, stomach tightening. He hadn't heard of any auction last time he came down, but he hadn't exactly kept up with Red Creek's affairs. He'd learned to keep his distance. Now, though, that banner pulled at something deep and unsettled in him. Still, he pressed on. His first stop was the clinic, but the clinic was dark, doors shuttered, the sign gone, only a chalk scroll on the glass, closed indefinitely by order of the marshal. Noah stared at it, pulsed, drumming in his ears. That made no sense. The doctor, old Harlan Wexley, had served this town for over 20 years, never missed a day. Noah remembered him patching up Caleb's head after a fall. Quiet and kind, he knocked once, then again nothing. He turned uneasy. Something felt wrong, not just in the air, but in the way people moved too quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. And then he heard it, a voice rising above the low hum of the crowd in the square. Loud, triumphant. Next up, finest set. We've had this, spring healthy, obedient strongbones. Noah's gut turned cold. He walked faster, then ran. The square was packed of men in coats and hats, faces lit by lanterns strung from the rafters of the auction block. And there on the stage behind ropes and flanked by men with rifles stood Miriam and Caleb. Noah stopped dead, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Miriam's hair was loose, matted, her dress torn at the sleeve. Her hands were bound in front of her, fingers raw. Caleb's little boy stood clutching her side face, pale, coughing still. Around both their necks hung thick parchment tags dangling like cruel decorations. 300 woman age 28, good health. 125 boy age 6, needs care. Noah's knees nearly buckled. His heart thundered in his chest like it was trying to tear free. He couldn't make sense of it. Not at first. Slavery was outlawed, had been for years. But this wasn't called that. Not in Red Creek. They used different words. Indentured debtors' property for hire, legal fictions, justifications carved in ink and spit, and someone had written out a value for his wife, for his son in public in bold. Noah moved before he knew what he was doing. Down the steps, through the crowd, pushing, shoving, blind with fury, a man grabbed his arm. Noah broke his wrist. Another stepped in. He shoved him hard enough to send teeth scattering across the dirt. The auctioneer turned startled just in time to see Noah leap onto the stage like a storm given form. Two guards reached for their rifles. He was faster. The butt of one rifle cracked bone. The second hit the ground without firing. Screams. Chaos. Miriam cried out, "Noah!" But he couldn't hear her over the roaring in his blood. He wrapped her in his arms, lifted. Caleb shielded them both as the crowd scattered like startled cattle. A gunshot rang out close. Another zipped past his ear. He spun, kicked over a crate, grabbed a lantern, and flung it hard. Flames bloomed across the wooden plank's fire, leaping like vengeance from dry timber. In the panic, he ran down the alley through the smoke, Caleb wheezing against his chest. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of town, breath ragged, legs shaking. Noah laid them gently beneath a grove of cedar trees, hands trembling. Miriam clutched his coat, whispering his name again and again, like it was the only thing keeping her from breaking. Caleb coughed, curled up against her. Noah stared back toward the glow of fire rising over the rooftops, jaw clenched. Who had done this? Who had dared, and why now? He'd find out. He'd burn through the truth the way the flames had taken that stage. But first he had to get them to safety. Back to the mountain, back to the one place he could still control, where no one else could put numbers on the ones he loved. The sky above the treetops had begun to shift from smoke gray to the deep blue of night, and the firelight from Red Creek still flickered like a dying heartbeat in the distance. The auction block had been reduced to scorched timber and ash, but the damage ran far deeper than charred wood. Something had broken that day. Something inside Noah Thorne that had already been worn thin by years of quiet suffering. He hadn't said a word since they fled. The square hadn't explained, hadn't asked questions. Miriam could see it in his eyes. That old look she hadn't seen in years. A look that spoke of vengeance, not justice, of reckoning, not reason. Noah stood at the edge of the grove, still as a tree, scanning the trail behind them. His coat flapped in the wind, darkened by sweat, and soot rifles slung across his back. Fists clenched like stone. The fire had drawn attention, sure, but the noise had given them a head start, and for now the woods kept them hidden. Miriam sat nearby with Caleb nestled against her lap, wrapping what little fabric she could around his shaking body. She'd been trying to warm him with her hands, her breath, anything she had, but the cold had sunk deep into his bones. He coughed again, wet rattling, and Noah turned instantly. "We move now," he said, voice like gravel. "We can't wait for them to regroup." Miriam nodded without protest. Her eyes were swollen from smoke and fear, but her legs moved. She picked up Caleb as best she could, staggering once before Noah swept the boy into his arms and held him against his chest. For a man with such fury burning through his veins, he held the child with astonishing gentleness. Without another word, they turned back to the trail, heading north, away from the town, back into the thick woods and up toward the ridges, where the paths twisted and the world narrowed into wilderness. The ascent was slow. Caleb was dead weight in Noah's arms, and Miriam's energy flagged with every mile, but neither complained. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been carved into them. The silence was their language now. Every glance, every breath, every step was a prayer not to collapse. By midnight, the moon had emerged, casting its pale light across the forest floor. Noah led them off the trail and down a narrow gulch he knew well, a place hunters avoided because of the cliffs and the sudden drop in terrain. That was why he chose it. The ground was uneven, the rocks slick, but they had no other choice. Twice Miriam slipped. Once Noah reached out just in time to catch her. The second time, she didn't fall. She just stopped. Her body shook as she leaned against a tree trying to breathe. "We have to rest," she whispered, her voice. "Caleb needs warmth." Noah looked down at his son. The boy's lips were tinged with blue, his forehead slick with sweat despite the cold. He nodded once, then pointed to a thicket up ahead, where the rock formed a shallow overhang half concealed by brush. It wasn't much, but it would block the wind. He carried Caleb there and laid him down gently, then began gathering dry sticks and moss, his fingers working quickly, despite the pain searing through his muscles. Within minutes he had a small fire going, its light dancing across the rock like fragile hope. Miriam cradled Caleb close again, feeding him sips of water and murmuring soft words. Noah sat nearby, staring into the flames, his mind racing. He hadn't recognized most of the men in town, but one face burned in his memory, sharp as a branding iron. Deputy Marshal Granger, a man who used to work under the old lawman back before things in Red Creek had turned sour. Granger had always wanted more authority, more power, more control. And from the way he stood near the stage watching the auction with a smug smile and a clipboard in hand, no one knew he hadn't just allowed Ether was running it. But Granger didn't act alone. Red Creek was too big now, too hungry. That kind of rot needed roots and owners, councilmen, maybe even the preacher. Folks who'd sell anything if it kept their boots clean and their pockets lined. Noah didn't know how far it went, but he knew this much. They had crossed a line, and they had touched what no man should ever dare. Miriam finally spoke after a long silence. "They came 2 nights ago," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Said you owed taxes, claimed we were on county land, and that you hadn't registered it proper. They gave me an hour to pack." Noah didn't interrupt, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the fire, but he let her speak. "When I asked to see a writ, they showed me some paper with a seal I didn't recognize. Looked official, but it felt wrong. Granger was there. He just watched while the others tore through the cabin, took our supplies, dragged Caleb outside, said if I didn't comply, they'd take him first." Noah's hands curled into fists. The muscles in his arms tensed so hard they trembled. "They brought us to town that night," Miriam continued, eyes wet. "Locked us in the livery. Next morning they took our names, asked about next of kin, said we could buy our freedom if someone paid the debt." "What debt?" Noah growled, voice low. "I don't know. They just said the land wasn't yours anymore, that you owed back fees for mountain permits. Some made-up law." Of course it was. Noah had seen it coming for years. Show. Red Creek kept reaching farther, swallowing homesteads with paperwork and men with badges. The law had become a tool, a weapon wielded by the greedy. He stood slowly. The firelight caught the edge of his knife as he unsheathed it and began carving a mark into the bark of a nearby tree. A simple sign that meant something only to him, a warning, a promise. Miriam watched him, unsure. "You're not going back, are you?" she asked quietly. "I'm not leaving you," he replied, still focused on the carving. "But I'm going back. They won't stop. Not now that they've tried this." She said nothing for a while, only stroked Caleb's hair and stared at the fire. Then with a voice that trembled, she asked the one question she'd been holding in her heart like a stone. "What if they come again? What if they take him while you're gone?" Noah turned, his eyes burning like embers. "They won't. But if they do, they won't," he said again, more forcefully, though the tremble in his hands betrayed him. That night, none of them truly slept. The fire burned low, and the wind whispered through the trees like a warning. Noah kept watch, blade in hand, eyes scanning every shadow. Miriam dozed in fits, jerking awake at every branch crack. Caleb whimpered in his dreams, clutching the scrap of blue cloth Noah had returned to him. When morning came, it brought with it a thin mist and the sound of something distant, hoof-beats. Noah was already on his feet, rifle-loaded, eyes narrow. He motioned to Miriam to keep low. The sound grew louder. 2 riders, no more coming from the South Trail. Not a full patrol, likely scouts. Maybe stragglers looking to follow their tracks. Noah moved without hesitation. He looped around the thicket, took position near the bend in the trail, and waited. The first rider was young, no more than 20, nervous eyes, poor posture. The second was older, mustached, confident. Both wore Red Creek badges. Noah stepped out as the first passed. One shot. The young rider fell before he could reach for his pistol. The second turned startled, but Noah was already, the rifle raised, voice cold. "Drop it." The man hesitated, then slowly let his revolver fall. "Where's Granger?" Noah asked. "In town," the man stammered. "Is the council's calling a meeting about what happened?" Noah narrowed his eyes. "They expected this." "No, not like that. They're spooked. Half the buyers backed out after the fire." "Good," Noah said. And then he knocked the man unconscious with the butt of the rifle. He stripped the badges off both bodies and returned to the thicket. Miriam stared at him wide-eyed. "What now?" she asked. Noah handed her the badge. Now we start turning their system against them." He didn't explain what he meant, but in his mind the plan was already forming. They had used rules, false laws, and badges to take what wasn't theirs. Now he would take something back, one lie at a time. The cabin sat cold and hollow when they returned, its doors still hanging slightly open from where the lawman had kicked it in. Snow melt dripped from the eaves in slow, steady beats, pooling on the warped floorboards and soaking into the old rag rug Miriam had made during their first winter on the mountain. Inside it smelled of ash and mildew. The half-cold furniture, overturned shelves emptied, but it was still home, still theirs, and for now it was shelter. Noah helped Miriam and Caleb inside and barred the door behind them. He'd carried the boy the last 2 miles uphill without pause, knowing full well the ride back to the ridge had sapped the last of his own strength. But there was no room for rest yet. He built a fire first, his hands moving from habit, even as exhaustion weighed on every limb. Then he drew water from the cistern and set it to boil. Only after Caleb was tucked beneath thick quilts and Miriam had warmed her hands by the fire did Noah allow himself to sit. But even then he didn't relax. He sat at the table with his knife out, sharpening it slowly against a wet stone, eyes locked on the flames. Miriam said nothing. She could see the storm brewing behind his quiet, deeper than rage, steadier than panic. Something cold, unrelenting, a purpose that had begun to take shape the moment he saw that price tag hanging from his son's neck. "Granger thinks I'll hide again," Noah said suddenly, voice low. "He thinks I'll run to the trees and hope the storm passes." Miriam didn't answer. She didn't need to. He wasn't looking for confirmation. He was laying foundation. "He's wrong." She waited, then asked gently, "What do you plan to do?" Noah didn't look at her. "Whatever it takes." He stood and went to the back wall where he kept his gear. A heavy pack, a coil of rope, a rusted old saddle holster, and a long oilskin coat that hadn't seen use since the days when his name still held weight in Red Creek. Before the cabin, before the mountain, before he'd chosen silence. One by one, he began preparing, oiling his rifle, inspecting the pistol he'd taken from the unconscious scout, counting every bullet he had left. Miriam watched in silence. It wasn't the violence that frightened her. It was how still he was, how methodical. Caleb stirred under the blankets and began coughing again. Miriam moved quickly to his side, cupping his cheek, whispering soft things. Noah paused long enough to watch his son's small body tremble, then turned back to his pack with renewed purpose. He would not let this stand. He would not live in a world where children could be weighed and bought like mules, and if it meant pulling Red Creek apart piece by piece, so be it. The next morning he left before sunrise. Miriam didn't try to stop him. She handed him a flask of broth, a roll of dried meat, and a torn scrap of map with trails only they knew. She kissed his cheek and whispered something that only made sense to them, something from their early days. And then he was gone, moving silent and sure through the trees. He didn't ride. Not yet. The mountain's thorned paths would give him away too easily. He traveled on foot, hugging the ridgel lines, sticking to the shadows. It took him the better part of the day to reach the outskirts of Red Creek, and by the time he arrived, dusk had begun to bleed across the sky like spilled ink. From his perch above the town he watched. Red Creek had changed more than he'd realized. New fences, new faces. The general store had been expanded. The church now had stained glass, and the council hall, formerly a modest 2-room structure, had become a large stone building with flags posted out front. The town had grown fat, and fat things grew careless. Noah moved closer as night settled in. He waited for the guards to change. Shifts there were 2 now posted at the council hall, both yawning between idle complaints. He slipped between buildings, crossed the alley behind the saloon, and crept toward the livery. Inside, the stalls were empty, but for a few unfamiliar horses and a half-oz in crates stacked near the wall, each marked with a symbol he recognized. RCCI, Red Creek Indenture. These were the tools of the trade. Now chains, ledgers, parchment tags, evidence of the system that had nearly destroyed his family. He took one of the crates, carried it into the hills. By morning, word spread of a fire in the woods near town. Some said it was bandits. Others whispered it was the mountain man. But all agreed on one thing. The crate that had gone missing contained the council's master registry. Names, amounts, debt claims, locations, and now it was ash. Granger rode through town that afternoon, red-faced and barking orders, demanding the sheriff mobilize more deputies, offering rewards for information. But the sheriff knew man young and overwhelmed just nodded and scribbled in his ledger, already unsure whether to fear Granger more than the ghost in the trees. Noah watched it all from the roof of the old cooper's shop, hidden beneath shadows and soot. He'd begun his work. That night he struck again, this time at the marshal's office, not with fire, but with theft. He took the ammunition cache, every round, every shell, and left behind a simple note scrolled in charcoal. Your laws won't save you from the truth. The town was in chaos the next morning. Businesses shuttered, guards posted, councilmen arguing in the street. Granger fumed like a cornered wolf pacing outside the saloon, pistol holstered but twitching. And that's when Noah made his move. He walked into town in daylight, unarmed. Every head turned as he passed. Some recognized him. Others just saw the way the crowd parted for him, the way even the wind seemed to slow. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He walked straight to the chapel where Councilman Barrett, the town's richest man, was known to take his supper. Barrett was seated with two others when Noah stepped inside. The room went still. Cutlery clinked kid once, then silence. Noah Thorne, Barrett said, voice steady but cautious. Didn't think we'd see you again. You shouldn't have, Noah replied. Barrett leaned back. I suppose you're here for explanations, answers. No, Noah said, I'm here for terms. That caught them off guard. Terms, Barrett repeated. You'll dissolve the indenture program, Noah said flatly. Burn every contract release, every person still listed. You'll give them their land back, their names, their lives. Barrett scoffed. And if we don't, Noah stepped forward. Then I take from you what you took from them. Granger burst through the chapel door, rifle raised. Enough! Noah didn't move. You think you're a hero, Granger spat. You're a criminal, an animal. You've been in the woods too long, Thorne. There's law here now. Civilization. Noah turned, met Granger's eyes. Civilization doesn't hang price tags on children. Grurz's face twitched. You're under arrest. You'll need more than that badge to stop what's coming. And with that, Noah turned and walked out. He expected gunfire, expected steel, but none came. Not then. Granger didn't fire. Barrett didn't call the deputies. They all just watched him go because deep down they knew something had shifted. The people were watching. And when a man like Noah stood in daylight and dared the system to strike him down, it meant the ground was no longer steady beneath their boots. By the time Noah returned to the hills that night, Miriam had heard the whispers. A rider from town had passed near their ridge, talking to himself, muttering about ghosts and revolutions, and men who walked into fire and came out untouched. You showed yourself, she said when he returned, setting down the bag of supplies he'd taken from the store. You made it known. I did, he replied, handing her the medicine he'd finally secured for Caleb. Now we wait. For what? For them to come, he said, eyes hard, and for the town to decide who it belongs to. The waiting didn't last long. By the second morning after Noah's bold return to town, the sound of riders echoed through the lower ridges like thunder. Miriam heard them first standing on the porch with Caleb cradled in her arms, the wind tugging at her shawl. She turned to find Noah already at the tree-line, peering down the slope, with his rifle raised, the same quiet intensity in his eyes that had carried them through the storm. He didn't speak, didn't move, only watched as 6 figures crested the lower bend and began their slow, careful climb. They weren't rushing. That told him plenty. These weren't men sent to fight. They were sent to scare. A message wrapped in spurs and polished boots, as if intimidation alone would loosen his grip. He'd seen that tactic before on farms seized without warning, in towns where councilmen ruled with ink-stained fingers and tongues slick with falsehoods. They thought they knew what he was. They thought a man in the mountains could be cowed just because they knocked on the door politely. But they'd forgotten who built the door. No emotion to Miriam. Inside bolted. She hesitated only a second before nodding, stepping back into the cabin and drawing the latch firm. He moved then, not toward the porch but around the back, with a slope dipped down into a shallow ravine lined with thick pine and a natural ridge that curved behind the homestead like a protective arm. Years ago, when he built the place, he'd carved hidden paths and cleared sight lines, not out of paranoia, but caution. Back then, it had been bears he feared most. Now it was men with clean hands and black paper. He reached the ridge just as the riders approached the clearing. 6 men, 4 on horseback, 2 walking, Granger at the front. The deputy marshal wore a fine coat now freshly stitched and pressed with polished boots that looked wrong on mountain soil. He dismounted slowly theatrically, like he was stepping into a church instead of a family's land. "No, a thorn," he called, voice ringing through the trees. "You've made quite the mess down there, and here I thought you just wanted to live quiet." Noah didn't reply. "We come under flag of talk." Granger continued, lifting one hand half-heartedly. "Council thought maybe you'd see sense. Town's nervous. Whole operation's on hold. We'd like to find a resolution." Still, Noah said nothing. He moved down the slope like shadow itself, using every inch of terrain to his advantage. When he reached the boulder that sat 10 feet above the clearing, he stopped, raised his rifle, and let it rest across the flat stone. Granger was still talking. "Thing is," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat, "you're not the only one in trouble now. You've stirred something you don't understand. People are watching outside. People, this town's not some forgotten hollow anymore. It's growing, and growth brings order." Noah shifted his voice, finally breaking the silence, calm and even. "You mean buyers?" Granger blinked. "You don't want order," Noah continued. "You want profit. You want people too scared to push back." The deputies behind Granger stiffened. One of them stepped forward, hand on his gun. "You pointing a rifle at an officer of the law? I'm pointing a rifle at a man who put a price tag on my son." The silence that followed was thick. Granger's face twitched, anger, fear. Something caught between control and unraveling. "You can't stop it," he said. "Quiet now. You can delay it. You can burn paper, but the system moves on. You've got no council, no law, no town behind you. Just a wife, a sick boy, and a shack." "Good," Noah said. "Makes me harder to find." The shot rang out so fast no one saw him pull the trigger. It wasn't aimed at them. It hit the saddle horn of Granger's horse clean through the crack, echoing like a whip crack through the trees. The horse reared, panicked, nearly throwing its rider. Granger fell back, tripped, and landed hard in the dirt. The other men reached for their guns, but Noah was already gone, melted into the woods like breath in winter. By the time they regrouped, he was back at the cabin. The door bolted, his family inside. They didn't come again that day. Instead, the town sent a message. Late in the evening, as Miriam boiled water for Caleb's medicine and Noah paced the edge of their clearing, a small bundle was left at the base of the trailer parcel, wrapped in cloth, left quietly and without witness. Noah found it the next morning. Inside was a handwritten note and a child's shoe. "Stop or others pay." There was no signature, no seal, just those 4 words. The implication wasn't subtle. He brought the bundle inside and showed Miriam. Her face paled. "Who else doesn't matter," Noah said, though his jaw had gone tight. "They've started bluffing. Means they're desperate. But the shoe, it's not Caleb's." He knew what came next. Threats like this only happened when fear took hold of a system used to control. The council was scrambling. Granger was grasping. And that meant their grip could be broken. But they would retaliate. They take someone, anyone, a settler, a shopkeeper, a drifter too poor to fight back. And then they blame it on laws, on debt, on orders from above. It would look legitimate on paper, but it would be punishment, a warning, a message. Noah stared at the note long and hard. "We need to go back," Miriam said suddenly, eyes filled with quiet resolve. He looked at her, startled. "What, we can't sit up here forever. You struck first. They'll strike again. And if we're not there to stop it, someone else suffers." He searched her face. She was tired. She was frightened. But she was right. "You want to go down into town," he said flatly, "with Caleb sick and a price on our heads." "I want to finish what you started," she replied. "And I'm not letting you do it alone." He exhaled slowly. Then he nodded. It took them a day to prepare. Noah packed what they'd need: blankets, food, the forged deeds, and names he'd taken from the council office during his first raid. Miriam gathered Caleb's medicine, a set of clothes still clean, and what few coins they had left. When they left the cabin that night, it was under cover of fog and cloud, the moon hidden, the trails muffled by pine needles and damp earth. They reached Red Creek by dawn, but they didn't sneak in this time. They walked straight through the main road, dust and silence following their steps. Caleb, still weak but improving, rode in Noah's arms, bundled against the morning chill. Miriam walked beside them, head high, hair tied back. A few shopkeepers froze when they saw them. A woman dropped her basket. Children stared, but no one called out. No one raised a hand because something had shifted. The fear had cracked. Outside the council building, the deputies stood confused, caught between drawing their weapons and obeying some unwritten rule that said daylight mattered more than courage. Noah walked past them without pause. Into the building, into the chamber where Granger and Barrett sat hunched over parchment, arguing in low voices. They looked up in disbelief. "You can't just—" Granger started standing quickly. "You've got two choices," Noah said, voice steady. "End this or I end it for you." Barrett scoffed. "You think a few speeches and papers can undo what's built here?" Noah laid the deeds on the table, dozens of them scorched at the edges, some incomplete, others blank but signed. "I don't need speeches. I have proof. Fraud, forgery names of buyers' dates. You've been selling people under false warrants, and now everyone will know." Granger looked at the papers, then back at Noah. "You won't make it out of town." "Maybe not," Noah said. "But if I fall, everything burns. You think you're the only one with copies?" Barrett palled. Miriam stepped forward. "Let the people go, every one of them. Today, tear down the block. End the auctions or this town becomes smoke." And then for the first time since the fire, Barrett looked afraid. It didn't end that day, but it began to end. The town didn't riot, not openly, but the whispers spread. People stopped showing up to the auctions. Buyers withdrew. Deputies began resigning. One woman burned her own ledger outside the courthouse. Within a week, the council dissolved itself for review. Granger disappeared soon after. Some said he left for the coast. Others believed he'd been buried in the hills. No one looked too hard. As for Noah and Miriam, they didn't stay in Red Creek. The town was changing, but slowly, too slowly. They took Caleb and left for the northern valleys, where justice still had a name, and peace wasn't earned in blood. But folks in Red Creek never forgot. They remembered the man who came down from the mountain with fire in his heart and his family at his side. The man who didn't seek revenge but made sure the ones who profited from pain would never sleep quiet again. Autumn settled early in the northern valleys. The trees wore fire on their limbs, leaves falling in slow rustling waves like the last soft breaths of summer. The sky turned heavier, lower winds began to scrape across the hills like hungry hands. The Thorne family had made their way north far past the old mining roads and forgotten stagecoach lines to a place where even the most desperate men hadn't yet drawn maps. Here they built something quiet again. But peace, like frost, never truly lasts. Noah never unpacked fully. He built the cabin by hand once more. This one smaller than the last, tucked between two fur-covered ridges that looked like giant sleeping beasts. The roof was low-slung, the chimney built with stones from the stream that twisted a mile down the hill. It wasn't a fortress. She didn't want one, but it was defensible. That mattered more than comfort now. Miriam didn't ask why he kept the rifle loaded by the door, or why he carved signal notches into the trees, or why he taught Caleb, even at his young age, how to distinguish boot prints from paw prints. She knew why. Because while Red Creek had collapsed from the inside, its roots had run deep, and roots don't die just because the trunk falls. There were still names on those lists Noah had stolen, still debts someone somewhere expected to collect. The council had fractured, the auctions had stopped, and Barrett had vanished into silence. But the money behind it, all the real money, had never shown its face. It was still out there, waiting, watching. The first sign came in the form of a rider. He arrived one cold morning, just after sunup, silent as breath. Noah saw him from a distance, black coat. No pack, no badge, no insignia. Just a man on a strong, dark horse, moving with the kind of casual certainty that said he wasn't afraid of anything on this earth. Noah didn't greet him. He just stepped off the porch, rifle cradled, but not raised, and waited. The rider stopped 20 paces out. He didn't remove his hat. "Noah Thorne." Noah said nothing. The man nodded as if that was answer enough. "I'm here on behalf of some interests who believe you may still be in possession of documents that don't belong to you." Noah's jaw tightened. "You mean proof, I mean property," the rider said, voice dry as dust. "Stolen from the records office in Red Creek. Now, certain parties are willing to forgive your previous disruptions, provided you return what was taken and agree to refrain from further exposures," Noah cut in. The man blinked, unbothered. "The world runs on contracts, Mr. Thorne. On agreements. Your son's situation, while regrettable, was legally documented under county law. The system you fought isn't illegal, it's just efficient. Noah's fingers curled around the rifle stock. You came here alone, he said, calm but cold. You think that makes you brave? I think it makes me clear, the man replied. We're not like the men you dealt with before. We don't send dogs. We offer options, refuse, and what follows will be less negotiable. Noah's eyes flicked toward the Treon. He knew these types polished detached. They didn't pull triggers they paid others to. They didn't bleed. They collected. There's no deal, Noah said. The man nodded almost respectfully. You won't see me again. And he turned, rode off, and disappeared into the rising mist like a spirit sent to test the resolve of mortal men. That night, Noah sat up by the fire long after Miriam and Caleb had gone to bed. He didn't sharpen his blade, didn't clean the rifle. He just stared into the flames, his thoughts quieter than silence itself. He had known it wasn't over. Not really. But hearing it spoken aloud by a man who didn't threaten, didn't sneer, only offered options, like a merchant haggling over crates, that chilled something deeper in him than the law ever had. The next week passed quietly. Too quietly. Noah scouted the hills. No tracks, no smoke, but the air felt different, tense. The birds were quieter. The woods normally humming with wind, and echoes seemed to hold their breath. Even the creek ran softer. Then came the second sign. He found it one morning nailed to a tree less than 50 ft from the cabin. A plain wooden stake freshly hammered with a paper nailed to it. The ink was still wet. It wasn't a bounty notice. It was a contract. Indenture pending. Names Miriam Thorne, Caleb Thorne. Status, reclamation authorized. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He just pulled it down, read it twice, then burned it slowly in the hearth, while Miriam stood silently beside him, her hand trembling against his. They're trying to scare us, she said. They think they still own us, Noah replied. The next day he took Caleb and vanished into the woods. It wasn't escape, it was protection. He showed the boy how to move without leaving tracks, how to find safe places to hide, how to use a stone to knock down a bird in flight, how to listen, not with ears, but with stillness. Caleb didn't complain. He didn't ask why. He followed his father with quiet, watchful eyes, and Noah felt the weight of it in his bones. He didn't want this life for his son, but he would make sure it was a life he could survive. When they returned, the cabin was untouched, but the horse was gone, not stolen, taken. The tether had been sliced clean. Tracks led down toward the old mining path, then vanished in the stream bed. Noah said nothing, but he moved the family again, this time deeper. A new shelter, a hidden one. Nothing permanent, just a place to outlast the storm. Because he knew what came next. They weren't going to threaten anymore. They were going to send someone who didn't care about laws or signatures, someone who didn't want contracts, just outcomes. And they did. It was 3 nights later. Noah was out setting dead falls when he heard Eater sound too controlled to be animal, too erratic to be wind. He moved quick, silent through the underbrush, ducked behind a fallen pine, and saw the flicker of a lantern through the trees. 2 men, no uniforms, no words, just movement, searching. He circled wide, flanked them close enough to hear one mutter something about a woman and kid. That was all he needed. He dropped the first with a stone to the back of the head. No noise. The second turned just in time to see the glint of steel before Noah slammed the butt of the rifle into his chest. They weren't trained, just hired. He didn't kill them, but he made sure they couldn't walk back to town for days. He took their boots, their weapons, their papers. Inside one man's coat was a letter. Mr. Thorne is not to be approached directly. Locate and retrieve the subjects. Do not engage unless fired upon. Payment upon completion. No name, no seal, just a stamp. Westwood Securities Holdings Division. That was the answer. That was the hand behind the curtain. He knew of them, a company that claimed to own nothing but bought everything. Land contracts, debt. They never showed up in person. They bought governments, hired lawmen, rewrote maps. They didn't build empires. They inherited the Moan deed at a time. Now they wanted his family. He returned to the shelter at dawn, eyes bloodshot but hands steady. Miriam saw the letter, read the name, and said nothing. She just nodded because she understood something deep and unspoken. This wasn't just about Caleb anymore, or even Red Creek. This was about all the towns, all the broken families, all the names on those lists. It was about making sure Westwood Securities never sent another letter like this again. That night, Noah buried the weapons in 3 different places. He scattered false trails. He left carved symbols along the tree and sold ranger marks for danger retreat and fire follows. And then he began preparing for the long ride. Because there was only one place a company like that would keep their real records. The ledger vault located not in Red Creek, but far east where the rail lines crossed the edge of the frontier. A town called Harrow's End, built entirely by the company, guarded like a fort, no mayor, no church, just a station, a stockade, and the biggest collection of indenture contracts west of the Mississippi. If he could reach it, he could burn what was inside. It wouldn't just end their interest in his family. It would collapse their entire claim to the frontier. He didn't tell Miriam the full plan. Not yet, but she saw it in his eyes as he packed his rifle and saddlebag, as he placed a kiss on Caleb's head and pressed a hand gently to her shoulder. "You'll be careful," she said, not as a question. "I'll be fast," he replied. She gave him a folded piece of cloth. "What's this?" "A name," she said. "Someone inside Harrow's End, someone who wants them to fall." He didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded once, then rode out before dawn, the mist swallowing him like the last breath of peace before a long and unforgiving fire. The sun rose slowly behind him, casting long shadows across the ridge as Noah descended into the lands. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Harrow's End lay eastward across a stretch of land so empty it swallowed sound, swallowed time. Few went willingly and fewer came back with their names still their own. It wasn't just a company town. It was a mausoleum for the hopes of those who thought they could own their freedom. If Red Creek was the serpent's fangs, Harrow's End was the heart it coiled around. Noah rode hard the first 2 days, following no road, only memory, and the whisper of rivers he'd mapped long ago. His horse own he'd taken off, the men who came for Caleb, was strong and sure-footed, though it bore the brand of Westward Securities beneath its flank. He kept it covered. A horse with a mark like that could get a man hanged or worse ignored if the wrong eyes spotted it. On the 3rd night, he camped beneath the boughs of a leaning cedar, wind biting through the gaps in his coat. He didn't sleep much. The stars above were clear, and that bothered him more than a storm would have. Clear skies made it easier for trackers to find you, and he knew the company wouldn't wait long to realize 2 of their men hadn't returned from the mountain. Still, he pressed on deeper into the basin, where rail lines stitched the earth like scars. And there, rising out of the hills like a blister, stood Harrow's End. The town wasn't large, but it felt massive. Buildings were made of steel and stone, no wood allowed. The streets were paved, something rare out west, with iron lampposts that burned gas even in daylight. There was no general store, no saloon, no chapel, just the depot, the bunkhouses, and the vault. It stood at the center of town, 3 stories tall, shaped like a courthouse, but built with prison bricks. No windows, only vents near the roof. 2 guards posted at the front door, rifles held loose but ready. Above the steel door was a plaque carved with Latin words Noah couldn't read. Beneath it, the company seal, a compass wrapped in chains. He didn't go near it. Not yet. He found lodging in one of the travel arrest houses on the outskirts, meant for visiting inspectors or hired muscle passing through. He gave no name, paid in silver, wore his hat low, and kept to the shadows. He walked the town slowly, listening, watching. The people here didn't speak much. Those who worked for the company wore gray coats and brass pins. Those who didn't walk like ghosts, their eyes sunken, their boots worn thin. Even the children didn't run or play. They moved in silence like they were part of the machinery now. Every person had a file. Every file had a weight. He spotted the name Miriam had given him scrolled on the side of a tool shed near the railard. W.L. Grant. No title, no message, just those 2 initials. He waited until dusk, then circled back. Inside the shed was a man hunched over a crate of signal lanterns, coat too big for his thin frame. He looked up startled, but didn't reach for a weapon. "You the one she sent?" he asked, voice rough with disuse. Noah nodded once. Grant studied him a moment. "You're older than I expected." Noah didn't answer. "She said you'd be quiet." Grant muttered, then beckoned him inside and shut the door. The man smelled of oil and smoke. His hands were stained with grease, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp for a laborer. And when he sat, he moved like someone trained to vanish. I used to be a clear in the vault, he said, back before I made the wrong friend. What happened? Grant gave a crooked smile. Found out the contracts didn't end ever. Even the ones marked complete got refiled. Children born in debt, widows kept on the hook after their husbands died. All legal, all neat. He leaned closer. There's a ledger, he said, not the surface stuff, the deep record old as the company handwritten. It's what they use to settle disputes between branches. If something's in there, it's gospel. Burn that, and everything they've built collapses. Where is it in the basement vault bottom level, only accessed with 2 keys owned, carried by the station warden? The other kept by a handler who visits once a month. The handler's due tomorrow. Noah sat back. That meant a window, a narrow one. But it was something. They'll expect him, he said. Grant nodded. Grant, which is why you're not going in as a stranger. From beneath the floorboards, he pulled a uniform. Gray coat, brass pin badge engraved with a name. Samuel Ward. Stole it off. A handler who didn't make it back to the train one night. Grant said flatly. He was drunk. Unwise. Noah took the coat. It fit well enough. The hat hid his eyes. The pin gleamed like it had never been worn. At dawn, he walked into the depot like he'd been doing it for years. No one stopped him. No one looked twice. The key he needed was delivered to the front office just after noon, just as Grant had said. Noah signed for it under Ward's name. The clerk handed it over with a polite nod, then turned back to her papers without a second glance. He in hand, Noah made his way to the vault. The main chamber was colder than expected. Stone walls, gas lighting flickering above filing cabinet, stretched in every direction, organized by year and location. This was the surface record, the part meant for auditors. He ignored it. At the far end was a stairwell guarded by a metal door with 2 locks. The station warden, bald, severe, and perpetually irritated, was already waiting holding his key. About time, he muttered. Thought you handlers were supposed to be punctual. Noah said nothing, just nodded and unlocked his half. The door creaked open, revealing a stairwell carved into the bedrock. The vault's basement was narrow and dry. The walls were lined with stone, and the smell of old ink hung heavy. A single lantern flickered on the table in the center of the room, and behind it, on a stand made of iron and oak, sat the ledger. It was larger than expected, bound in red leather edges, blackened with age, no title, no seal, just a book full of names. Noah stepped forward. This will take a while, he said, voice. Don't linger, the warden replied. You've got an hour. Then he turned, climbed the stairs, and sealed the door behind him. Noah opened the ledger. The pages whispered as he turned them thin and precise. Row after row of handwriting names, codes, debt totals, reassignments, entire generations listed as assets. There it was, Caleb Thorne. Entry dated years before the boy was even born. Noah's hands clenched. He took out the oil canister Grant had given him, soaked the base of the book, then stacked the older pages beneath it like kindling. With a strike of flint, the flame caught. It didn't roar. It hissed. Slowly, deliberately, the fire began to devour history. Above him, footsteps. Too soon, he doused the room in oil. Every corner, every cabinet lit 2 more flares and dropped them behind him as he turned and sprinted for the stairs. Smoke rose like a curse. The upper floor guards shouted. The warden screamed something about betrayal. Alarms rang, but Noah was already out the front door before the second explosion collapsed the south wing. The vault burned like judgment. He didn't stop running. Outside chaos. Men shouted. Buckets flew. The townsfolk gathered in horror and awe as the symbol of their chains melted into ash. Noah slipped through the alleyways, stripped off the coat, discarded the badge, and emerged on the far side of town like a shadow unmade. Grant was waiting by the old water tower with a pack and a horse. You lit it every page. Grant smiled, and for the first time it didn't look tired. They'll come after you. They already are. Grant reached into his coat and handed Noah a folded paper. What's this A train schedule? There's a smuggler line out east. Doesn't ask questions. Gets you near the border. Noah tucked it away. And you? I've been dead to them for 2 years now. Now it'll just be official. They clasped hands. Then Noah rode. He didn't stop until the mountains rose up again, welcoming him home like a father who never forgot his child. Miriam met him at the ridge. He didn't need to speak. She saw the soot on his coat, the burns on his gloves, the paper still smoldering at the corner of his pack, and she wept not out of fear but relief because, for the first time since Red Creek, she believed they might actually be free. But freedom has a cost, and Noah knew Harrow's end wouldn't forget. Not now, not ever. 3 days passed without sleep. Even as Miriam cleaned his wounds and Caleb lay curled beside him in the small cot beside the fire, Noah couldn't rest. Not really. His body ached, his fingers cracked and stiff from the burns, and the inside of his mind wouldn't quiet. The ledger's pages burning each one a name. A life played over and over behind his eyes. He wasn't haunted by regret. He would do it again. But it wasn't over. Not even close. He knew men like those who ran Harrow's End. Their vengeance didn't come loud or fast. It came quiet, systematic, and final. The vault burning wouldn't stop them. It would only provoke them. By the 4th day, Noah had dug out the last of the company bullets from the base of the cabin walls. The night of the firemen had come this way. Strangers he didn't recognize. Armed with brand new rifles and quiet eyes, they hadn't knocked. They had waited in the trees and watched. And only the instinct of a man who'd lived too long with ghosts had caught their shadows in time to stop them. 2 were buried beneath the pine behind the cabin. 1 had crawled away into the dark, leaving a trail of blood Noah had followed for a mile before it vanished into the creek. They weren't scouts. They were testers, seeing if he still had his teeth. And now they knew he did. He told Miriam to pack only what she needed. Caleb didn't ask why. He was quieter than before, more withdrawn. But Noah saw the way he watched the horizon, the way he kept the knife Noah had given him close to his leg, as if expecting it to be needed. Children shouldn't carry that kind of fear. But Caleb had learned, just like Noah had in another time, that safety was a season, and like all seasons, it could pass. They moved before sunrise on the 5th day, headed northwest toward the old trader routes carved before the war. Paths no longer watched by rails or road patrols. Noah knew them well. He'd mapped them in a different life when his compass still pointed towards some higher duty. It took them 6 days to reach the old quarry abandoned since the vein went dry. The earth there was torn and ruined, but the caves provided shelter, and from the higher ground you could see for miles. If someone came, you'd know. They stayed there 2 weeks hidden in the stone. Noah hunted deer when he could traded pelts to an old miner in a nearby gorge for dried beans and lamp oil. Miriam taught Caleb to write his name with coal on the cave walls over and over until the black dust stained his fingertips. They made it feel like a home, though it wasn't. Noah never let the fire go out. But time doesn't stop, and neither do men who lose something valuable. It was Caleb who heard them, first in the distance, too many to be travelers. Noah stepped out into the dusk, pressed his fingers to the earth, and felt it too. A low vibration, steady organized company riders. 6 men dressed in dusters with no emblems, rifles on their backs and cold eyes in their heads. Noah recognized the lead one even before he dismounted. A man called Travis, former Union tracker, worked for Westwood as a fixer. Rumors said he pulled 3 men from a well with his bare hands just to get a signature. Noah Thorne Traversal, out as if reading it off a docket. Noah said nothing, just stood in the cave's mouth with the rifle lowered but ready. "You've caused quite the mess," Trevor's continued, voice calm, like a banker talking interest rates. "Burned down a vault, interfered with sovereign company property, killed licensed men under contract." "They came to my home," Noah said finally. "You were trespassing on corporate land." Noah's eyes didn't blink. That mountain was mine before it was ever theirs. Travers tilted his head. "The land don't matter. You do." Behind him the others spread out. Not flanking, though. They were too proud for that. Just making sure there weren't other shooters hidden in the rocks. They didn't expect an ambush. They expected compliance. "We're not here to kill you," Travis said. "That would be wasteful. The board wants you to make this right. Come with us. Put the fire out, so to speak. And if I say no." Travis smiled, and it wasn't kind. "Then we come back with 30. From behind Noah, Miriam stepped into the cave light, holding Caleb's hand. The boy's eyes were wide, locked on the horses, the rifles, the way Travers spoke like he owned the world. Miriam didn't speak. She didn't have to. Noah looked down at his son, then back to the man on the horse. "Tell your board," Noah said. "The fire's just getting started." He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't need to. He walked back into the cave, turned his back on them. and that defiance was louder than any bullet. Travers didn't follow. He just spat on the ground and turned his horse. Noah knew what came next. They'd leave. Then they'd send the real storm. And so they moved again deeper into the timberlands across the frozen pass where roads hadn't existed in decades. The journey was brutal. Miriam's hands cracked from cold. Caleb's cough worsened at night. And Noah's leg, injured long ago in the war, burned with every mile. But they kept moving. Not to flee, but to build. Because somewhere out there between the mines and the rails were people like them. People who'd signed contracts and never got out. People who'd buried children while paying off interest on the grave. People who knew what it meant to owe more than you could ever give. Noah found them. Old trappers, widows' men, who deserted from payroll caravans, afraid to admit they'd been used up and tossed aside. They called them ghosts, those who vanished from the company ledger but kept breathing. And now those ghosts had a name to rally behind. Thorn, the man who burned the vault. The man who said no. They came in pairs. Then by the dozen, Noah taught them to track, to shoot without being seen. Miriam organized food stores, drew maps, found dry caves and safe paths. Caleb listened to everything, watched everyone, and in his silence he learned what kind of world he'd been born into. Then winter broke, and Harrow's End sent a train not filled with goods but guns. The men aboard weren't scouts. They weren't message carriers. They were enforcers. Noah knew their kind. He'd worn the same look. Once they set up camp near the river bend, built a temporary outpost with spotlights, steel-plated wagons, and a rotating watch schedule. Noah watched from the trees. He didn't strike immediately. He waited. Patience was a weapon too. The company wasn't expecting resistance, not real resistance. They thought they were hunting rabbits. But what they found were wolves. On the fourth night, a supply cart went missing. No sound, no sign, just gone. 2 nights later, a guard vanished from his post. The next morning, his rifle was found hanging from a pine branch like a flag. The company grew nervous. Noah let them. On the 7th night, he walked into their camp alone. He stepped out of the trees while they were cooking rations, coat dark with mud hat low. They raised rifles, shouted commands. He didn't flinch. "You're trespassing," he said loud enough for every man to hear. One step forward, young, barely shaving. "You're the one who torched the vault." Noah didn't deny it. "You're dead," the boy said. But there was fear in it. Noah stepped forward once more. "You can leave now," he said. "Take your train, go back east, or you can stay and find out what ghosts can do." They didn't shoot. They were too scared to. Noah turned and walked away. By dawn, the camp was empty. Word spread faster than the rails could carry it. And suddenly, people who'd whispered their pain for years began to speak aloud. They wrote Thorne's name on barn walls in charcoal. They etched it into rail ties. In the desert town of Gaywater, an old woman refused to pay her widow's tax and mailed the letter with a single word written on the envelope, Thorne. And far away in a boardroom where men in suits counted everything in shares and leverage, someone whispered that one man was too dangerous to leave breathing. But Noah didn't care about legends. He didn't care about the whispers. He cared about the boy in the bedroll beside him and the woman who slept with her back to the door, always ready. He cared about the fire they'd lit, not the one that burned buildings, but the one that lived in the hearts of those who still remembered what it meant to be free. They wouldn't stop, and neither would he. The snows thawed faster that year, as if the land itself had decided to be merciful for once. Streams that had been frozen through the heart of winter now ran clear and fast, cutting through the mountains like veins reawakening. The high winds no longer howled with bitter sharpness, but whispered through the pines carrying the scent of pine bark and old ash. Spring was never a promise out here. It was a negotiation. And even now in its early warmth, Noah knew not to trust it, just like he didn't trust peace. Not really. The land was quieter than before, but that didn't mean it was safe. Noah, Miriam, and Caleb had taken refuge in a stretch of wooded valley, far removed from the paths they once walked, tucked beneath the ridges of White Elk Hollow. A scattering of cabins left behind by fur trappers generations ago stood like forgotten teeth against the treeline. They'd chosen the most intact stone roof, still firm fireplace, still drawing, and spent days cleaning out old nests and rot. Miriam tended to the hearth. Caleb hauled fresh water from a nearby spring. Noah dug into the earth and hid their reserves, eyes always on the tree and ears, tuned to the movements of birds overhead. The quiet couldn't last, and it didn't. One morning the birds stopped singing. Noah stepped outside with his rifle slung low and his heart already climbing. A shape moved through the trees, too smooth for an animal, too slow for a deer. He signaled Caleb inside with one quick nod. Miriam already had the rifle ready by the door. They were beyond practice now, like a wheel that turned without needing oil. But what stepped into the clearing wasn't a threat. It was a man alone, wearing no badge, no uniform, no sign of company allegiance. His coat was worn, boots cracked from the journey, and his hands were empty. He looked like someone who had come to deliver news, not bullets. Noah kept his stance firm. "Name's Thorn," he said plainly. "I know," the man replied, pulling a slip of paper from his coat pocket and holding it out without stepping forward. "I was told to find you." Noah didn't move. "Who told you that, everyone?" That answer didn't satisfy him, but the way the man said it, quiet, tired, certain, spoke of truth. Noah finally stepped forward, took the paper, and read it. There was no company seal, no demand, no bounty, just a sentence written in rough charcoal across old parchment. "Tell him we're ready," no signature. But Noah understood. He nodded just once, and the man turned and walked away into the trees without waiting for a reply. That night around the fire, Caleb asked what the message meant. Miriam didn't interrupt. She watched Noah closely, knowing the answer would be more than words. It would be a vow. "It means," Noah said slowly, "that it's not just us anymore." The war hadn't started yet, but the pieces were moving. Over the next weeks, they moved with purpose. Through valleys and over ridges, Noah led his family across the old back trails where corporate patrols dared not tread. They met others, some in hiding, some waiting, some lost. Each had a story, each had a scar. Each had heard of Thor and the burning vault, and each one, without exception, had something to offer. Ammunition, maps, a name, a prayer. There was Ruth, the blacksmith's daughter from Deadwater, who'd been branded with a debtor's mark at 16 and sold to cover her father's mistakes. She escaped with nothing but a hammer and the memory of chains. She made her own forge in the belly of a cave, and from it shaped weapons of defiance. There was Daniel, a preacher whose entire congregation had been evicted in winter by rail companies looking to widen their path. He no longer wore a collar, but still carried a byloan stained with the names of every soul he'd buried on snow-covered ground. There was Roscoe, a former rail guard who once served the board with pride until he watched 3 children hang for stealing grain. He turned in his badge the next day and never looked back. And there were more. The forgotten, the misused, the angry. Each of them burned quietly, waiting for a reason to become flame. Noah gave them that reason, not with speeches, not with flags, but by showing up, by surviving, by fighting back, and refusing to let the world forget what they'd done to him, to his wife and child. Obedience. Noah stood slowly, brushed the pine needles from his coat, and looked toward the horizon. "Ready?" Miriam asked. He nodded. Beside them, Caleb took his father's hand. The 3 of them standing as the sun rose behind them, painting the sky in shades of defiance and hope. The war hadn't ended, but the world had changed because one man had said no, because one mother had refused to be broken, because one boy had learned that his name was worth more than gold. And somewhere in the fire-lit darkness of Harrow's End, a company man stared out his window and realized something that chilled him deeper than any winter storm. Some debts don't get paid, some debts rise, and sometimes the price of a man is the last thing you should ever try to sell.